Okay, so welcome to this lunch talk series of Data Power Law. This is the third lunch talk. This is a lunch talk organized by the chair of Public International Law and Human Rights Law. It's the chair of Nora Marquardt, and it's a cooperation with the association Netzpharma, which is an association for feminist net policy, which has also published this year an anthology on artificial intelligence and feminist perspectives. And in this lunch talk series, we talk about data-based algorithms, the power relations in and through them, and the role of law in all this. And I think a talk in which this will be crystallized a lot is the talk today with Petra Molnar, which is moderated by Pia and Fabi.
Thank you, Vicky. I will give a short introduction into the topic. Data-based technologies are by now everyday tools at Europe's external borders and in migration management, while data protection is not. Today, we will talk about where and how data-based technologies are used at the European external borders and what the electronic eye implies for refugees and other migrants and their human rights. This is a 1-hour lunch talk, and we will start with a roughly 10 to 15-minute input by our speaker, Petra Molnar. And then Fabi and I, as the moderators, will each ask a question to kick off the discussion and highlight different aspects of Petra's research. And then the floor will be open for questions by you, the audience. Exactly. I'm handing over to Fabian now.
So this lunch talk will be moderated by Pia, Lotta, Storf and me, Fabian Endemann. We both work as research assistants at Professor Marquardt's chair. Pia focuses in her PhD project on group-based refugee status determination, and I focus on the history of the concept of human rights jurisdiction. Now to our lunch talk guest today. We are very delighted to have Petra Molnar as our guest here on Zoom today. Petra Molnar has studied anthropology and law. Currently, she is a lawyer and researcher specializing in technology migration and human rights. She is working on the impacts of migration control technologies on the lives of people on the move. Her work has appeared in numerous academic publications and popular press. She is a co-author of the study Bots at the Gate, which focuses on the human rights impacts of automated decision-making in immigration and refugee systems. Petra is also currently doing field work in Greece again. So one great advantage of Zoom might indeed be to be able to talk to researchers working in the field on the ground, as you do in Greece, Petra. So I think we are also very lucky in this respect to be able to talk to you here. So yeah, so now I hand over to you, Petra. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fabian and Pia, and to all of you for inviting me. It's so generous of you, and absolutely, you're right. As much as it would be nice to connect in person, at least we can do so electronically. I'll take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing here in Greece, and also share some images from my field work. Really, but what I hope to do is that we can find a way to have a productive conversation all together about some of these issues that are so difficult to parse through when it comes to trying to understand how technologies are playing out in real people's lives. I'd like to start off with a quote that I have a permission to share with you today. It's from Adisu, a young man from Ethiopia who is living without status in Belgium. I had a chance to meet with Adisu last year when I was doing field work for the report that we published later that year called Technological Testing Grounds, and I can drop a link to that report in the chat. When Adisu and I met in an occupied building in Brussels, essentially a squat, we were trying to parse together some ideas about technology, surveillance, and the border regime. And I think Adisu sums it up pretty nicely here. He says, "We are Black and border guards hate us. Their computers hate us too." I think it's important to start off with the perspectives of people on the move, and not in an extractive way, although a lot of our work already is extractive inherently, but perhaps that's a topic for another talk. But to situate the lived experiences of people crossing borders at the center of the conversation when it comes to the technological experiments that are playing out in and around the border, both in the European space, but also globally. As you so noted in the generous introduction, I started off my work in Canada in this space, but I'm not a digital rights person by training. I'm an anthropologist and I'm a refugee lawyer. And 3 years ago, I didn't know what an algorithm was. I was on Wikipedia a lot, let me tell you. But what really troubled me and my colleagues when we started looking into these issues is precisely the kind of gap in terms of accountability and public knowledge when it comes to the types of technologies that are used in and around the border. I've now spent over 2 years trying to trace the impact of migration management technologies on real people, and would like to situate my brief remarks today in this space with you. Just a brief note about the photos as well. In a lot of my work, I've been really lucky to partner with Kenya Jade Pinto, whose most of the photos that you will see, especially the good ones, are hers. She's a lawyer turned photographer and filmmaker, and she was with me in Lesbos last year when the Moria camp burnt down. You will notice that in a lot of the photography that we use to illuminate both our report, but also the work generally, they are quite specific in the fact that they don't feature Black and brown bodies in distress. That is done deliberately because the space of forced migration and the kind of visual politics that are inherent in the work are incredibly damaging, and they play out very particular tropes around what some people have called poverty porn, and what something I've unfortunately noticed a lot in my work as well, this kind of reification of the refugee and the migrant as a victim. We don't take pictures of people without their express permission, unless they are participants in our project. And so a lot of the photography that you will see are mostly images of the context. And also because we're trying to track surveillance and technology, a lot of the photos are, for example, of police and other surveillance mechanisms, which sometimes doesn't make them very happy. But again, a lot of my work tries to unpack the broader ecosystem in which a lot of this technological experimentation takes place. And this broader ecosystem is really important to consider because, once again, you know, none of this technological development and deployment that we're talking about develops in a vacuum. We are increasingly seeing anti-migrant sentiments, the rise of xenophobia globally, also the criminalization of migration in a variety of jurisdictions, and also this kind of confluence between the national security apparatus and immigration. And a lot of the kind of discourse around public interest as is baked into different types of policy documents, including the Europe's new migration pact. Because again, these are broader strategies of bordering, of border imperialism, of the way that the border as an idea is structured and shaped and practiced. And again, if we bring it back to the context of Europe and look at the new migration pact that was released last year, it's really quite clear that this set of policy agendas is replete with ideas around containment, surveillance, and deterrence. And this is now playing out in this technological space through a variety of different projects. And I'll mention a few of them to you, and hopefully we can discuss more during the conversation that we will have together afterwards. In my work in Greece, we've been trying to track, for example, the development of 5 new camps, or multi-purpose reception and identification centers, or MPRICs as they are called. They are going to be on the 5 islands that are close to the Turkey border, ones that have been the hotspots since the refugee crisis started in 2015. But what's really interesting is that all 5 camps are slated to be equipped with a variety of surveillance equipment, including cameras, motion analysis, algorithmic monitoring, and a variety of other unpiloted drone technology, which is already replete in that area already. And yet what's fascinating is, for example, the camp on Samos that is currently being built and ready to be open has no water. I was there just a few weeks ago and tried to see what the situation was like on the ground. And it's concerning to talk to people who say that they're not sure how people who are going to be warehoused in this camp are going to have access to water. And yet, we are spending vast amounts of money on a variety of surveillance type technologies without thinking through, you know, the other kind of services, for example, that might be necessary in spaces like this. What's interesting too is, you know, when I speak to people who live in the current camp and are going to be moved to this new one on Samos, they are increasingly aware of this kind of surveillance panopticon surrounding them. But what they're most concerned about is how this surveillance and this technology is further going to marginalize them, how it's going to remove them from services, and also aid in this kind of geographic segregation that we are seeing increasingly in a lot of the forced migration settings in Greece, but in Europe specifically. We're also, you know, trying to track other types of experiments and other types of border tech that has been on the rise over the last number of years. For those of you who are keeping track of what's happening in Greece, you might have come across the so-called sound cannons or long-range acoustic devices that were very proudly deployed last month at the land border between Turkey and Greece. Now, that is a very violent use of technology with a very clear motive to deter people from coming in the first place, to exercise their internationally protected right to claim asylum. And for those of you following the pushback situation in Europe, it's clear that this, again, is a logic that allows the state, and also not just the Greek state, but also European Union writ large, to be able to promulgate these particular discourses around deterrence, containment, and pushing people as far away from the border space of Europe as possible. We've, of course, been seeing other types of technology assisting in pushbacks as well, such as unpiloted drones in the Aegean and Mediterranean, and not to mention this kind of automation verve that we're seeing at the border space. For those of you in the room might be already familiar with a variety of different types of pilot projects that are out there, one being, for example, the iBorder Control project, the so-called AI lie detector that was proudly rolled out and piloted a few years ago. There's a very similar one called Avatar. So again, there's this kind of appetite for automation, for surveillance, and for increasingly bringing technological experiments into the space here. But again, I want to make something really clear. This isn't just Greece. Greece, for me, became an entry point into these situations here in Europe. But we're talking about a broader logic, one that is regional, as in the European Union space, but also global. We are seeing very similar types of ideas and projects and testing grounds occur in Canada, at the US-Mexico border, in a variety of use cases in the Middle East and North Africa. And again, it's important to interrogate this from that broader perspective, because it all ties together. Because looking at these issues in isolation doesn't really get us anywhere. We need to understand it from this kind of political economy perspective, this kind of connection, this web in which different types of projects are allowed to move forward and different priorities count. Now, we could spend a whole hour talking about the different human rights impacts, and perhaps that's something that we can get into in the Q&A, but we know, for example, that a variety of algorithmic decision-making is biased and discriminatory. We know, of course, that the vast collection of data, particularly in spaces like this, has an incredible impact on people's privacy rights. But again, I think the context here is important. We are talking about forced migration. We're talking about sometimes humanitarian emergencies. And we're also talking about spaces where legal conceptualizations of things like informed consent kind of break down. Because if you are in a situation where you have to give your data in exchange for food or in exchange for a humanitarian service, we're really not talking about free and informed consent anymore. We're talking about a vast power differential where you feel compelled to participate in the system of data collection and automation in order to feed your family, or in order to process your asylum application, or feel safe in the European zone. And unfortunately, this kind of power differential is something that's playing out pretty much across the board when we're trying to understand how migration management technology is experienced by the people who are at the sharp edges of this development and deployment. Now, again, bringing it back to the broader kind of ecosystem in which all of this is happening, private companies are also ones that I think we need to interrogate. The private sector plays a major role in the way that we are talking about technology and in the way we even imagine what is possible in this space. Not to mention, private companies are making bank. It's very lucrative to be in the border industrial complex. And to have lucrative deals, even with international entities like the World Food Program and Palantir a few years ago, or vast other array of different public-private partnerships that are in place. But again, I think it's if we zoom out and we talk about the priority setting and agenda setting, it's really, really clear that the private sector is the one that sets the stage. Why are we, for example, developing AI lie detectors to be tested out on people on the move at the border? Why aren't we using AI and automated decision-making to root out racist border guards? There are very, very clear logics that are playing out once again along established lines of power and privilege. And these lines, of course, also historical, and the communities that are on the move and that are at the sharp edges of these technological testing grounds are ones that are historically made marginalized and remarginalized. And also people who are on the move, people who are claiming asylum, often don't have access to the same mechanisms of redress that you and I might. Oftentimes people don't even know, for example, that certain technology is being deployed against them, and that might actually impact the decisions for their asylum or for their family reunification, or even their ability to access services or enter the country. And again, what's really concerning for me is that even in a lot of these kind of conversations, the lived experiences of people who are actually living in spaces like this are not part of the conversation. Sometimes they're an afterthought, sometimes they're tokenized as a way to get policymakers to try and care. And I'm aware that sometimes even our work can slip into that kind of area where showing images of refugee camps like this one on Lesbos is meant to evoke a very particular reaction in an audience. What we're trying to do, particularly at the Migration and Technology Monitor, is to upend this power hierarchy and bring people with lived experience of these spaces actually into the conversation through participatory action research, through upending the kind of hierarchy of power that is inherent in funding of particular projects. But it is slow work, and it's an important, I think, way of also trying to change how knowledge production around these issues actually moves forward. Because at the end of the day, it's about broader questions. It's not just about technology or human rights or even the border regime, but it's about who gets to participate in conversations around proposed interventions. And perhaps even about world building, who gets to participate in what our world looks like, especially during COVID and eventually, hopefully, post-COVID. Because of course, we haven't really touched on the pandemic, but the kind of rise of biosurveillance and this state of exception that we are in and continue to be in legally and daily, is unfortunately a space that has allowed for the progression of a lot of this technology to occur at a much faster rate than before. But really, at the end of the day, I just want to go back to that point about priorities. Whose priorities get to set the agenda? Why are we developing particular technology over others? And why are certain communities, once again, that are historically marginalized, left out of the conversation entirely? Because at the end of the day, for me, what's most disturbing is that this hubris around technological solutions and this kind of allure of quick fixes doesn't address why people are compelled to migrate in the first place, the kind of systemic and historical reasons that are perpetuated and re-perpetuated in the system and in the world that we currently live in. I think I'll leave it there so that we have enough time for questions and a conversation. And thank you so much for giving me the space to share a little bit about my work. And I'll drop a link to our report in the chat for those of you that are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra, for this very, very interesting talk. I have a lot of questions, and I don't know where to start, but I think I have to start somewhere. So I think you said a lot about how regulatory strategies and legal mechanisms, power mechanisms, serve states to single out migrants as a testing ground, so that they have to participate in these technologies, and they also sometimes don't know how this might play out if they participate, and so on. So my follow-up question on this would be if we can also take a migrant perspective and ask how can this technological power be contested by migrants themselves, or are there practices that give them agency, also in like practices, technological practices? Are there ways to activate also human rights? Like, I don't know, perhaps you have in mind some human rights that are really interesting in terms of technology, or are they completely empty here? Yeah, that would be my first question for you, Petra.
Great, thank you. And that's a really important question, because as I think it's very clear in my intervention, you know, I really look at the kind of negative, sharp edges of the way that this technology is playing out. But of course, there are also ways that communities in question use the technology in a variety of ways to contest kind of bordering regimes that people are facing on a daily basis. You know, I can drop a few links into the chat for a variety of projects and groups that I've come across that are, you know, using different digital communication strategies, for example, and ways to be able to access services or to connect with family. You know, I think there's really great coalition building that is happening increasingly more and more between lawyers, academics, civil society, and kind of migrant justice organizations that are, you know, the ones that are kind of pushing for particular changes. But I think it's a tricky space to try and think through kind of solutions, because it has to be from a variety of different perspectives and angles. We definitely need to support the kind of from the ground up perspectives, which is something that in our work we're really trying to push for. But also we need to think about regulation and the way that the kind of policymaking space in the European Union is reluctant to engage with particular ways to regulate technology, because it's very clear that, you know, for example, in the new proposed AI regulation that came out just recently, there's a matrix of high risk type of technologies, and border management fall under a high risk kind of matrix, which at first blush sounds really great, but then when you actually start unpacking the regulation, you realize that there's a lot of carve-outs and exceptions for national security and public interest and all of that. And once again, there's this conflation between the criminalization of migration and movement and all of that. You know, I think we need to have more conversations at every level, both from the ground up, both also from policymaking perspectives, and also amongst each other, you know. And I think this is where language and discourse is really, really important. And I just want to pick up on a comment that was actually just put in the chat. You know, I know I slipped into the terminology of crisis, which is something I try not to do, but sometimes it does slip out because I think we're all conditioned. And also sometimes from an advocacy perspective, using the term crisis can be useful. But of course, you know, it also has been done and overdone in really, really damaging ways that actually dehumanizes people who are on the move. And of course, you know, I hope that it's clear that in my framing for my work, we are actually trying to move away from this framing. If you look at our report, we don't actually even use the term migrant. We are trying to use terms like people on the move, which is much more expansive, and that also recognizes the fact that people are forced to migrate through these systemic and historical reasons and power relations between, for example, Europe and the rest of the world. So again, I think this also then goes into strategies of communication and strategies of knowledge production about these issues, because we need to also be careful and critical about the language and the images and the kind of framings that we use when we push for certain interventions in this space.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And my second question really focuses more on this group aspect, because for example, in the Refugee Convention, it foresees the possibility for each individual to claim refugee status and the associated protection according to the circumstances of the individual case. However, as you also mentioned, the political and societal discourse really evolves around flows and groups of migrants, and not even of like a more sensible and sensitive framing of what these people do who are on the move. And it really moves away from the case-by-case assessment which is also, or which can also be seen in the new Migration Pact, where people are supposed to be siphoned into different categories, and according to these categories are quicker processed or less quick. And my question really is how can this treatment as a collective or as members of groups be translated into migrants or migrants protection claims in law? Because as you said, we need to have a multiplicity of views, but we are also lawyers, and maybe there is a way to translate this into practical claims.
So I might out myself now. For those of you who might know me, I am a very reluctant lawyer. I actually think that the project of law and human rights is one that's also fraught and needs to be interrogated. But it's really tricky because I think human rights also give us a scaffolding on which to pin responsibility and potential mechanisms of redress. So it's difficult. It's something I really struggle with because I think I came into law a little later. I see it as a tool in my tool belt, but I definitely don't believe that it is a way forward in an all-encompassing way. But what's really tricky is we're also then dealing with really, really damaging practices and use cases and case studies in this kind of technological testing ground where human rights are actually really useful because, for policymakers in particular, to pin I guess like a theoretical abstract concept to discrimination law or to privacy protection or freedom of expression is something that I think people can wrap their minds around more. But what's also important, I think, at the same time is we need to expand certain definitions around rights and talk about different legal traditions also, like collective rights, and maybe decentering the individual in the conversation and talk about, what rights do we have as a society to privacy? And how does this differentially play out across different groups, right? I think it's going to be really fascinating in the next 5 to 10 years to see how different jurisdictions are going to be grappling with legal challenges, because there will be more and more coming. That's already clear. Europe in particular has already seen a few legal cases out there about algorithmic discrimination, a few, challenges to the UK's visa triaging algorithm, for example. I know there's a few more coming down the pipe, so keep an eye out for that. I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see even just how the judiciary conceptualizes the rights holder and what is even possible to claim in a court of law. Because I think, not to get too philosophical, but I think it's also forcing us to re-examine who the decision maker is and what the parameters of human cognition and human decision making really is. One of my favorite things that often happens when I give these talks to like the private sector or governments, they say, we don't understand what you're so worried about. There's always a human in the loop. Someone's checking this. So like, relax. But the problem isn't about the fact that there's a human in the loop. The problem is that we know that the phenomenon of automation bias is really real. And already we're talking about, again, the context of immigration and refugee decision-making. It's a context that is incredibly opaque. It's very difficult to parse out why particular decisions are made. It's incredibly discretionary. A lot of this discretion is written into law. I mean, when I used to practice, you would have two different immigration officials looking at the exact same set of evidence and come up with two completely different sets of reasons. That would be legally valid. And it's difficult to know how they arrived at a particular decision. Yes, of course, there's right to reasons and you have access to judicial review and all of that, but it just goes to show that it's incredibly subjective. And now that we're introducing some sort of automation along the spectrum of decision-making, what the tricky thing is going to be very difficult to know where that automation begins and where human cognition starts. And even though a person can say, well, okay, fine, obviously I'm the final arbiter of this, we know that human brains are primed to consider automated decision-making as somehow more objective or real. And again, if we then bring it back to the broader context of xenophobia, anti-migrant sentiments, assuming everyone's a liar unless they're proven not to be, credibility assessments are ones that are baked into refugee and immigration decision-making. There's an excellent book by a wonderful colleague of mine called Hilary Evans Cameron on precisely this. I'll drop a link in the chat. I think it's worth reading. These are issues that have been with us for years. So the problem is now we're going to be in a whole new kind of area where not only are we dealing with incredibly complex decisions, but now we're also muddying the water between who actually is the decision maker. And then how do you challenge that? If you are wrongfully deported as a result of an automated decision or partially automated decision, who is responsible? Is it the person who coded the algorithm? Can you sue them? Is it the immigration officer who used it? Should it be the algorithm itself? Does an algorithm have legal personality in a court of law? I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll have to see, but I think these are questions that are going to be with us.
Thank you very much for this very insightful answer.